Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin. Chapter 3. The Law. In explaining those things which are necessary for the true knowledge of God, we pointed out that no one can conceive of him in all his greatness without at once being seized by the thought that he is the only one to whose majesty supreme honour is due. As for the knowledge of ourselves, we have argued that the main thing is to rid ourselves of any illusions about our own strength and to abandon all trust in our own righteousness. However, we must also be humbled by the thought of our utter poverty and must learn perfect humility so as to abase ourselves and to cease all boasting. We observe both these things in the law of God. There, the Lord, after first reserving to himself the power to command, teaches us to revere his deity and shows us what this reverence entails. He then lays down the rule of righteousness and rebukes us both for our frailty and our lack of righteousness, since our corrupt and wanton nature is wholly averse to righteousness. It is offensive to us. We cannot match its perfection, because our ability to do good is weak and unavailing. Thus, the plan which we outlined at the beginning of this work brings us to our present discussion of God's law. Necessity for the written law. Now, everything which we should learn about the law is to some extent taught to us by the inner law, which, as we have said, is written and, as it were, imprinted on each person's heart. For our conscience does not let us forever sleep, impervious to all feeling, without inwardly testifying and alerting us to the debt we owe God, without showing us the difference between good and evil, and without convicting us when we fail to do our duty. However, man is so wrapped in darkest ignorance that through the natural law he is scarcely able to savour what it means to serve God acceptably. The least that can be said is that he is very far from knowing God aright. Moreover, he is so puffed up with pride and ambition, and so blinded by self-love, that he cannot contemplate himself or descend, so to speak, further into himself, in order to learn humility and to admit his misery. That is why our crude powers of understanding and our gross arrogance made it necessary for the Lord to hand down to us his written law, so as to bear positive witness to what was still obscure in the natural law, and by dispelling our indifference to touch with keener force our mind and memory. We are now in a position to understand what should be known about the law. That God, being our Creator, is entitled to be both Lord and Father to us, and that we must therefore give him glory, reverence, love, and fear. That consequently we are not free to follow our heart's desires wherever they may lead, but that we are wholly reliant on our God and must keep only to what pleases him. That he loves righteousness and integrity but hates iniquity. That if we do not want through willful ingratitude to turn away from our Creator, we must always cherish righteousness as long as we live and strive to make it our aim. For if we revere him alone as we should when we prefer his will to our own, it follows that the truest honour we can do him is to practice righteousness, holiness, and purity. Nor is it possible for man to excuse himself on the grounds that he lacks the power and, like the impoverished debtor, is unable to pay. It is wrong to measure God's glory by our own abilities, seeing that whatever may be true of us, God is always consistent in himself, a friend of righteousness and an enemy of evil. Whatever he asks of us, since he can ask nothing which is not just, we have a natural duty to obey. That we are incapable of doing so is our own fault. For if, captive and bound by selfish desire where sin reigns supreme, we're not free to obey our Father, We must not, by way of defense, plead necessity, whose evil lies within us and is imputable to us. The law reveals our need of God's mercy. If, through the teaching of the law, we have progressed to this point, we must, under its guidance, descend within ourselves. We will then draw these two conclusions. First, when we compare the righteousness of the law with the life we lead, and when we see how little we comply with God's will, we recognize that we do not deserve to keep our place and position among His creatures, still less to be reckoned as His children. Second, in weighing up our strengths, we should regard them not only as incapable of fulfilling the law, but as non-existent. Accordingly, we are bound to distrust our own powers and to feel distress and trepidation of heart. For conscience cannot bear the burden of sin without at once envisaging God's judgment, and the thought of God's judgment brings with it the dread of death. By the same token, one's conscience has learned from experience that it is weak. It can only despair of its own strength. Both reactions produce despondency and humility. The end result is that man, appalled by the prospect of death and sensing that it is near, a just reward for his lack of righteousness, turns to God's mercy alone as to the only safe haven. Knowing too that he is incapable of paying his debt to the law, he despairs of self, longs expectantly, and looks elsewhere for help. The Lord, however, is not content to teach us only to revere his righteousness. He seeks to train our hearts to love it and to hate iniquity, and thus adds both promises and threats. Because our mind's eye sees so poorly that it cannot be touched simply by the beauty and integrity of virtue, the Lord in his kindness has chosen to draw us to love and desire him by offering us a sweet recompense. He tells us, therefore, that he is willing to reward virtue, and that no one will labour in vain who obeys his commands. On the other hand, he reveals that unrighteousness is not only hateful to him, but also that it cannot escape punishment, since he is resolved to be avenged on all who despise his majesty. And to encourage us in every way, he promises both the blessings of this present life and eternal happiness to those who keep his commandments. It also threatens transgressors with physical calamities no less than with the torment of everlasting death. For the promise, he who does these things will live by them, and the corresponding threat, the soul that sins will truly die, undoubtedly refer to future death or immortality, which have no end. The fact is that wherever mention is made of the Lord's goodwill or of his wrath, the first denotes never-ending life, and the second, eternal destruction. Now in the law there is a lengthy recital of present blessings and cursings. It is clear from the penalties which God prescribes how great is his purity, for he cannot bear wickedness. And in the promises we see how greatly he loves righteousness, for he will not let it go unrewarded. Thereto is demonstrated his wonderful kindness. For given that we and all that is ours are in debt to his majesty, whatever he asks of us he rightly demands, since it is owed to him. To repay such a debt does not deserve recompense of any sort. He thus lays aside his right when he offers us a certain reward for our obedience which we do not render willingly, as if it were not a debt we owed him. Now how we may benefit from the promises themselves we will shortly learn. For the present, it is enough if we believe and understand that the promises in the law are a forceful endorsement of righteousness, allowing us to see more clearly how much God approves its practice. On the other hand, we must understand that the penalties are meant to make unrighteousness even more abominable, lest the sinner become so drunk on the sweetness of his sin as to forget that God's judgment is already prepared for him. The law, a standard of perfect righteousness. The fact that the Lord, in laying down a rule of perfect righteousness, related every part of it to his will, clearly shows that nothing is more pleasing to him than obedience. This is all the more noteworthy as the unruly arrogance of the human mind is too inclined to think of new honours and favours to pay God in order to gain his grace. In every age, this irreligious pretense of religion, being naturally rooted in our hearts, has always been visible in the human race, just as it is today. Men are always seeking to devise a way of acquiring righteousness apart from God's word. As a result, among all that generally passes for good works among men, the law's commands occupy only the tiniest place. Meanwhile, a vast host of human precepts are in the front rank, enjoying pride of place. Was it not this evil inclination that Moses most sought to curb? For after promulgating the law, he addressed the people thus: "Take note and listen to what I command, that you may prosper, you and your children after you, when you have done what is good and pleasing in the sight of your God. Only do what I command you, neither adding nor taking anything away." Earlier still, he had declared that the people of Israel had, with wisdom and understanding and before all the nations on earth, received judgments, justice, and ceremonies from the Lord. And he had added, "Look carefully to yourselves and your souls, and do not forget the words which your eyes have seen. Let them never vanish from your hearts." Since, in fact, the Lord foresaw that the Israelites, after receiving the law, would inevitably try to devise new ways of serving him unless he kept them on a tight rein, he proclaimed that in his word is found the very perfection of righteousness which ought to hold them in check. Even so, they did not refrain from the very impudence which had been forbidden them. And what of us? We, to be sure, are bound by this same word. Undoubtedly, it was always the case that the Lord intended his law to be the most perfect instruction in righteousness. We nevertheless are not content with it, but go to extraordinary lengths to fashion and devise one good work after another. The best way to cure this fault is to have it firmly fixed in our minds that the Lord gave the law to teach us perfect righteousness, and that it teaches no other righteousness than that we should conform ourselves to the divine will. It teaches us also that there is no point dreaming up new forms of work in order to obtain God's grace, since his lawful service consists only in obedience, and that to pursue good works which lie outside his law is gravely to defile his true righteousness. It will, however, be more fitting and fruitful to debate the function and uses of God's law once it has been explained to us. A first feature of the law: it claims our total obedience. Before we begin a detailed treatment of each point, it would be good to understand, in the first place, the overall nature of the law. First, then, we must recognize that the law is meant to rule and direct man's life not only to outward honesty, but to inward and spiritual righteousness. This is not something which anyone would deny, yet very few are serious about it, because no one cares about the lawgiver, by whose character the character of the law itself must be judged. If a king were to forbid by edict debauchery, murder, and theft, I admit that anyone who simply felt the desire to be promiscuous, or to steal or murder, but who stopped short without attempting to act, would not have to pay the prescribed penalty. That is because the purview of the mortal lawgiver goes no further than outward decency. As long as no wrong is done, his laws are not infringed. But God, from whose eyes nothing is hidden, and who does not stop so much at the outward appearance of virtue as at purity of heart, in forbidding debauchery, murder, and robbery, forbids all fleshly desire, hatred, greed for another's goods, deceit, and the like. Because he is a spiritual lawgiver, he speaks no less to the soul than to the body. So wrath and hatred are murder, so far as the soul is concerned, greed is robbery, and undisciplined love is debauchery. Someone perhaps will say that human laws, too, are concerned with men's will and intentions, and not just with random events. I agree, but there it is a matter of intentions which are openly expressed. The law in such cases considers the purpose of each and every act, but does not seek to know our hidden motives, so everyone who does not outwardly transgress satisfies the civil law. By contrast, because God's law is addressed to our souls, we cannot really obey it unless our souls are particularly kept in check. Most men, especially when they want to hide their contempt of the law, in some way train their eyes, feet, hands, and other limbs to keep the law's commands. All the while, their heart knows nothing of obedience, but they think themselves absolved if they conceal from men the things which are visible to God. They hear the words, "You shall not kill, you shall not commit debauchery, you shall not steal." As a result, they do not unsheath the sword to kill. They do not associate with the promiscuous. They do not lay hands on other people's property. All that is well and good, but their heart is full of murder and burns with fleshly lust. They cast only sideways glances at their neighbor's property, but are consumed by greed. In that respect, the essence of the law escapes them. How, I ask, can they be so unthinking, if not because, ignoring the lawgiver, they try to reconcile righteousness with their own understanding? Against such ideas, Paul protests loudly and clearly, asserting that the law is spiritual. By this he means that it demands not only obedience from the soul, mind, and will, but angelic purity, which, cleansed of every bodily stain, savours only of the spirit. In declaring this to be the meaning of the law, we are not offering a new explanation of our own, but are following Christ, who is a very sound expositor of it. Since the Pharisees had spread among the people the wholly evil idea that the law could be dutifully observed provided no external transgression was committed, he denounces their error, and says that to look lustfully at a woman is immoral, and that all who hate their brother are murderers. Thus all who, in their hearts, harbour anger of any kind, he condemns as guilty of judgment. All who by grumbling display a resentful spirit are guilty before the church court. All who, by slander, give proof of malice are guilty of hellfire. Those who did not understand this imagined Christ to be a second Moses who introduced gospel law to make up for what the Mosaic law lacked. Hence the popular saying that the perfection of gospel law is far superior to that of the old law. Now that is a most perverse error. It is a statement which does great disservice to God's law, as we will see from Moses' own words when we later review the sum of his precepts. It might also be inferred from this idea that the holiness of the ancient patriarchs was little more than hypocrisy. Its effect, lastly, would be to turn us away from the sole and perpetual rule of righteousness which God set forth at that time. It is an error easily refuted. These people think that Christ was merely adding to the law. In reality, he was restoring to it its integrity by cleansing it of the lies and leaven of the Pharisees which had failed and defiled it. Second feature. Command and prohibition are inseparable. In the second place, we should observe that God's precepts contain more than we find expressed in words alone. Nevertheless, we must always act with restraint, so as not to interpret them any way we like, by twisting them this way or that as we choose. There are some indeed who take liberties of this kind, so that the authority of the law is derided, as if it were unreliable or else incapable of conveying a sensible meaning. If possible, then, some way must be found which leads us safely and surely to God's will. That is, we must see how far an exposition may go beyond the actual words, so that it is clear that we have no man-made gloss added to God's law, but the pure, natural meaning of the lawgiver, faithfully expressed. It is of course evident that in all the law's precepts the part is put in place of the whole. Thus, anyone who seeks to restrict his interpretation to the words alone deserves only ridicule. Clearly, the soberest interpretation of the law must go beyond the words themselves, but just how far is unclear, unless we decide on some sort of standard. I believe that the best standard is that which takes account of the reason for which the precept was given. That is, for each and every precept, we should consider the purpose for which God gave it to us. For example, every precept seeks either to command or to forbid. We correctly understand each category when we observe the motive or objective which it has in view. As the fifth commandment has as its aim the honoring of those who, in God's eyes, are worthy of honor, this is the essence of it. God's will is that we honor those on whom he has conferred a certain superiority. To despise and willfully disobey them is abhorrent to him. The intention of the first commandment is that God alone should be honored. Overall, therefore, it means that genuine piety, the way in which we honor his majesty, is pleasing to God. Conversely, he detests impiety. Accordingly, we will first look at the content of each commandment, and then on the basis of what it says, we will attempt to formulate a contrary argument along these lines. If this thing pleases God, the opposite must displease him. If this thing displeases him, the opposite must please him. If he commands this, he must prohibit the other. If he prohibits this, he must command the other. For it is commonly known that whenever vice is condemned, virtue is commended. We, however, demand something more than men generally understand when they say such things. When they speak of virtue as the opposite of vice, they mean merely abstinence from vice. We go further, interpreting virtue as an act contrary to the corresponding evil. An example will make my meaning clearer. To the average mind, the commandment, "You shall not kill," signifies only that we should abstain from all wrongdoing and from the wish to injure others. I maintain, however, that more is meant, and that we must help to preserve our neighbour's life by every means in our power. And lest it be thought that I am speaking unreasonably, I will try to prove the truth of what I say. The Lord forbids that we should injure or hurt our neighbour, because he wants our neighbour's life to be dear and precious to us. That is why he lays on us the duty of love, by which life is to be preserved. In this way, we can see how the purpose of the commandment teaches us what we are commanded or forbidden to do. If we ask why the Lord only half signified what he willed, instead of clearly expressing it, several reasons might be given by way of reply. There is one, however, which I prefer above all others. Unless the vileness of our sin is in some sense tangible, the flesh always strives to camouflage or conceal it by empty evasions. Therefore, God chose to highlight the very worst and most desperate of sins in each category, so that merely to hear of them would inspire such dread as to produce in us a deeper hatred of sin. In judging moral failings, we are often deceived, for we minimize those which are in some small way inconspicuous. The Lord thus delivers us from our error, training us to relate each fault to a specific type, that we might better appreciate how repugnant it should be to us. For example, we do not seem to regard hatred or anger as a truly terrible wrong when we simply call them by those names. But when the Lord prohibits them by calling them murder, we have a clearer view of how much he detests them, since he gives them the name of so dreadful a crime. In this way, alerted by the judgment of God, we learn to better understand the gravity of the faults which we previously regarded as slight. Third feature: the two tables of the law. Third, we must consider the significance of the law's division into two tables, mention of which is frequently made in Scripture, and deservedly so, as any sensible person may judge. The reason for this is easily grasped, so that there need be no room for doubt. For because the Lord intended to teach all righteousness in his law, he divided it in such a way that he assigned to the first table the duties by which we are to honour his majesty, and to the second the works of love which we owe to our neighbour. Without doubt, the first foundation of righteousness is God's honour. Once that is overthrown, everything else is dissipated, like the various parts of a ruined building. For what kind of righteousness would it be if our neighbour lost nothing through theft or burglary, but we wickedly robbed God's majesty of its glory? Or if we refrained from defiling our bodies by debauchery, but besmirched God's name with our blasphemies? Or if we did not murder others, but endeavoured to blot out all memory of God? It would be just as futile for us to aim at righteousness without religion as it would be to make a beautiful display of a headless corpse. But to be truthful, religion is not only the head of righteousness and virtue, it is in a sense their soul as well, which gives them vitality. Men will never preserve fairness and love among each other without the fear of God. That is why we call God's worship the beginning and foundation of righteousness, seeing that, once it disappears, everything which men might contrive in order to live upright, chaste, and sober lives is vain and empty in God's sight. Likewise, we call it the fount and spirit of righteousness, because when men fear God as the judge of good and evil, they learn as a result to live purely and honestly. Thus, in the first table, the Lord trains us in godliness and religion that we might honour his majesty. In the second table, he shows on account of the fear we bear him how we must behave toward each other. For this reason, our Lord Jesus, as the evangelists record, summarized the law in 2 articles: that we should love God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our strength, and that we should love our neighbour as ourselves. We note that of these 2 parts, which together comprise the whole law, one he directs to God and the other to men. The structure of the 10 Commandments. However, although the law is entirely contained in 2 parts, our Lord, to remove every possible excuse, chose to reveal more fully and readily in 10 Commandments all that pertains to the fear, love, and honour of his deity, and to the love which for his name's sake he bids us show our neighbour. Our efforts will not therefore be wasted if we inquire into how the commandments are divided up, provided we remember that people are free to decide for themselves, and provided we are careful not to dispute with those who differ from us. I make this point in case someone is surprised by the division which I propose, thinking it to be a very recent invention. There is no question about how many commandments there are, since the Lord by his word has put the matter beyond dispute. There is disagreement only about their division. Those who divide them up so as to include 3 commandments in the first table and 7 in the second excise the commandment about images from all the rest, or else include it in the first commandment, despite the fact that the Lord set it down as a particular commandment. Furthermore, they thoughtlessly divide into 2 the 10th commandment, which bids us not to covet our neighbour's goods. There is another reason for refuting them. No such division was known in the early church, as we will shortly see. Others do as we do and include 4 articles in the first table, but they regard the first article as a simple promise which involves no command. For myself, I can only take Moses' 10 pronouncements as 10 commandments, unless convinced otherwise by clear reasoning. I also believe that they can be pointed out distinctly one by one. Therefore, while leaving others free to make up their own minds, I will adopt what I think is the most probable solution. The verse which they make into the first commandment forms, in my view, a kind of preamble to the whole law. Then the 10 commandments follow, 4 in the first table and 6 in the second, according to the order in which we will cite them. Origen has no trouble adopting this division as being the one most commonly accepted in his own day. Augustine also endorses it in the 3rd book of his letter to Boniface. It is indeed true that in another work he expresses a preference for the first type of division, but he does so for the flimsiest of reasons, namely that if only those commandments were included in the first table, it would represent the Trinity. Yet even in that work he makes no secret of the fact that in every other respect he likes our division better. In addition, there is another father of the early church who agrees with our opinion, the author of the unfinished Commentaries on Matthew. Josephus assigns 5 commandments to each table, which, one may guess, was a popular division at the time. Logic, however, is against this view, because it muddles the distinction between God's honour and love of neighbour. The authority of Jesus Christ is equally opposed to it, since he lists the command to honour father and mother under the second table. Now, let us hear the Lord himself speak.